Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Jose Salvador Alvarenga prepared to set sail from the shores of El Salvador in November 2012. His strong connection to the ocean stemmed from his youth, as he had been involved in fishing for most of his life. Born in a small coastal town in El Salvador, he had grown up closely tied to the sea. This time, Alvarenga decided to embark on a longer fishing journey, and he brought along his close friend and experienced fisherman, Ezequiel Cordoba. Both of them hoped that everything would go as planned on this trip, as fishing was not just a job but a way of life for them. When they set out from El Salvador, the journey began quite normally. Knowing that fishing at sea usually didn't last more than a week, the two friends had prepared their fishing gear and stocked up on food and water. The vast blue expanse of the ocean offered them peace, but also a slight sense of unease. However, Alvarenga believed nothing would stop him on this journey. As days passed, fishing and diving into the depths of the ocean became their favorite activities. They spent their time chatting with one another and enjoying the pleasures the sea provided. But one morning, something unexpected happened. The sky suddenly turned overcast, filled with dark clouds. Weather reports had warned fishermen of bad weather, but no one had predicted such a violent storm in the middle of the ocean. Within hours, the sea storm intensified. Strong winds and waves began to batter their boat. Alvarenga and Cordoba did their best to stabilize the boat, but the waves were so high that each time they tried, the boat was thrown off course, with each new wave larger and more frightening than the last. The power of the sea gradually pushed them farther from the shore, causing them to lose their direction. This storm will pass, Alvarenga thought, but as time passed, things worsened. Thunder rumbled, the wind howled, and the sound of the massive waves filled them with fear and anxiety. At first, the fishermen thought it was just a storm that would pass in a few hours. But several hours later, things had gotten much worse. The boat had completely lost its way. In the middle of the ocean, miles away from land, they were completely lost. When Alvarenga realized the boat had lost control, he felt utterly helpless. As he and Cordoba tried to find shelter, the rising waves pummeled the boat. At times, the boat took on water, but Alvarenga and Cordoba continued to fight for survival with their instincts. As the days went by, the storm's wrath and the ocean's fury pushed them into their worst nightmare. The storm seemed never-ending. In the days that followed, the boat, now completely lost, became directionless due to their inability to navigate. Alvarenga felt as if he was lost in the depths of the ocean. The boat couldn't find its way, and Alvarenga's biggest fear was that they would disappear completely in the vast ocean. Both of them desperately dreamed of reaching land and saving their lives. But no matter how hard they tried, the ocean showed no mercy. The storm continued for several more days. The powerful winds battered the boat, making it feel as though it were being torn apart by the forces of nature. Just a week ago, the two fishermen had set out to fish, but now they found themselves in the greatest battle of their lives, lost in the middle of the ocean, with no idea where they were, and no means of calling for help. They were slowly losing hope. Alvarenga's mind was consumed with one thought: this storm will somehow pass, and we will survive. But until then, they would have to sacrifice everything to stay alive. That moment marked the beginning of their survival fight, and it would lead them to a point deep in the ocean where they would have to rely solely on each other and their inner strength to continue. The storm eventually subsided, but in the middle of the ocean, the lost boat's fate became even more dire. Jose Salvador Alvarenga and Ezequiel Cordoba had to keep fighting for survival minute by minute. Their goal was to somehow escape the open sea and reach land, but in the vastness of the ocean, all they had left was their luck. However, at the start, their luck was not on their side. When the boat was lost, Alvarenga and Cordoba had only a few fishing supplies and enough food and water to last a few days. These supplies were woefully inadequate for a boat stranded in the middle of the ocean. As the days passed, their water supply dwindled and their food stocks grew dangerously low. But above all, Alvarenga had one thought in his mind: survival. The early days they tried everything to avoid losing hope. Whenever it rained, they did their best to collect rainwater for drinking. They attempted to fish using their fishing equipment, but the sea was rather unproductive, and the few fish they caught weren't enough for their survival. This solitary journey in the sea was becoming darker and more dangerous by the day. However, Alvarenga saw no other way but to keep trying everything possible to reach land. With each passing day, their food and water supplies began to dwindle. Both of them struggled to survive with decreasing food and water, and they had to encourage each other, convincing themselves that everything wasn't over and that there was still hope. Alvarenga would tell Cordoba, "One day it will rain. We will catch a fish and we will reach land," trying to lift his spirits. But the deepening hunger and thirst were beginning to stretch Alvarenga's hope to its limits. The first major loss came when Cordoba fell ill from malnutrition and slowly began to lose strength. Alvarenga noticed Cordoba's fever rising and realized he was sick. He spent more and more time with him, trying to offer him encouragement. But the illness, with no access to medical help in the middle of the ocean, became so serious that it would gradually lead to Cordoba's demise. As Cordoba's immune system weakened, he quickly became bedridden. Within a few days, he was struggling to breathe, and every movement caused him pain. Alvarenga did everything he could to survive in the middle of the ocean, but despite all his efforts, the boat never came close enough to help. He was sad, helpless, but there was nothing he could do. His inner strength stayed with him even as he watched his friend fade away. But surviving on a boat for so long was more grueling than either of them had ever imagined. One morning, Cordoba took one final deep breath and closed his eyes. Alvarenga looked at him, filled with fear and sorrow. His friend was no longer alive. In that moment, Alvarenga truly understood what it meant to be alone. In the middle of the ocean, in an endless sea, he was left all by himself. Alvarenga had lost his friend Ezekiel, with whom he had once fished, spent hours talking, and shared happy memories. His death left a deep wound in Alvarenga's heart, but the survival instinct pushed him into action once more. His spirit had been forced to cope with loss, but the desire to survive was stronger than anything else. He was now alone and had to fight even harder to stay alive. After Cordoba's death, Alvarenga was forced to continue the battle for survival alone. For a moment, he was overwhelmed by a sense of deep loneliness and helplessness, but the urge to survive and his strong inner determination lifted him back up. Now he had to survive not only for himself, but to honor the memory of his lost friend. A few days after the storm, Alvarenga continued his fight alone in the middle of the ocean. His food and water supplies were gone, but with his fishing gear and instincts, he kept venturing out into the ocean every day with hope. Collecting rainwater, catching fish, and finding other ways to obtain drinking water became his daily routine. The ocean showed him no mercy, but despite growing weaker each day, Alvarenga continued to battle death with his desire to survive. Alvarenga's next goal was to somehow abandon the lost boat swallowed by the ocean and reach land. But to do so, he would have to deal with the pain and challenges of his solitary struggle, pushing his body and mind to their limits more and more each day. Alvarenga knew that despite the loss of his friend, he had to continue the fight for survival. This was a journey that would test his strength and willpower. José Salvador Alvarenga had to fight harder each day to survive alone in the middle of the ocean. After the death of his friend Ezekiel, his state of loneliness and despair became his greatest enemy. However, surviving had now become Alvarenga's sole goal. The sparse rain, the ocean's lack of resources, and the diminishing supplies created bigger challenges every day. Alvarenga put everything he had into one purpose: to survive. One of the biggest challenges of living in the ocean was finding clean, drinking water. Drinking seawater was a fatal risk for a fisherman stranded in the middle of the ocean. For this reason, Alvarenga did everything he could to avoid drinking even a drop of seawater. At first, he tried to ration the limited water he had on the boat, but that resource quickly ran out. Alvarenga began to develop various strategies to survive in these harsh conditions. Rain could have been the greatest ally in ocean life, and Survival. Alvarenga waited for rain at every opportunity. He searched for ways to collect rainwater, using any materials he could to store it. With a few water containers and plastic bags they had brought onto the boat, collecting rainwater became his only source of drinking water. When it rained, Alvarenga would eagerly open his container, squeezing the first drops into it with his hands, preparing to drink them. The rain, sometimes lasting for hours, sometimes for just a few minutes, became a matter of life or death for him. However, under increasingly difficult conditions, the arrival of rain sometimes became a glimmer of hope. Even brief showers acted as a life-saving lifeline. Fishing was another key strategy Alvarenga relied on for survival. Fishing in the middle of the ocean seemed like a simple task, but under the harsh ocean conditions, it became increasingly complex. Initially, with the fishing gear he was able to catch some fish, but over time, hunting became more and more difficult. The water temperatures, the behavior of the fish in the sea, and the growing difficulties were wearing him down more and more each day. At first, the ocean seemed like a place where fishing was slightly easier. However, after the boat was lost, the waters became colder and murkier. Above all, finding fish in the sea became even more difficult. Alvarenga soon realized that hunting in the vast, deep waters of the ocean was not as easy as it seemed. Despite his early hope and attempts, he only managed to catch a few small fish. However, he had to rely on those fish, for they were his only source of food to survive. The fish became the essential food that fueled him for the next day. Hunting for fish and other marine life in the ocean was an extremely difficult task. Alvarenga continued to push forward into the open waters of the ocean with his boat, using every fishing skill he had. The boat was old, and constant movement made it even harder for him. Even catching the smallest fish required an increasing amount of effort as each day passed. Despite catching so little, he swallowed each fish with great hope. A single bite of fish kept him alive that day. The quest for food became an increasingly complex battle as the days passed in the middle of the ocean. Alvarenga began to lose hope as the search for food grew harder. In the silence of the sea, there were times when he couldn't catch any fish for weeks. The ocean, which he had once considered his own domain, had become his enemy. As the distance from land grew each day, food sources continued to dwindle. Alvarenga began to realize that everything he did to survive in the fishes' and other marine creatures' habitats was contributing to his ability to stay alive. Survival over time was not just about feeding his body. He had to keep his spirit alive with sheer determination. But one day, he became so exhausted that he thought even his survival instincts might need to make peace. However, that was just a momentary weakness. No matter what, he knew he would survive. The arrival of rain catching a fish was a glimmer of hope. Each day, as Alvarenga's inner strength was tested, the harsh conditions of the ocean were strengthening him even more. In the vastness of the ocean, while fighting his hardest battle, his desire to reach land grew stronger with each new day. Salvador Alvarenga, as each day passed alone in the middle of the ocean, faced a battle that wore down not only his physical endurance, but also his mind. The vastness of the sea was not the only challenge. The dark waters of loneliness also left deep scars in his mind. Beyond the storms, waves, and winds, the greatest battle he fought was within his own mind. An internal war, pushing his physical endurance to its limits, made him weaker with each passing day. As days, weeks, and even months passed, Alvarenga lost track of how time was moving. In the middle of the ocean, alone, in a void where time and space seemed to disappear, he struggled, more and more with feelings of isolation. He was so lost in time that he no longer knew how the days had passed. In the beginning, he tried to find morale, enjoying the sea and hoping to catch fish to reach land. But over time, beyond these physical efforts, keeping his mental health intact became more and more difficult. The hardest part of being alone was facing his inner world. Initially, Alvarenga was determined to stay mentally strong, but over time, the ocean presented him with a different kind of test. The greatest psychological burden was confronting loneliness, helplessness, and uncertainty. One day, while looking out at the sea, Alvarenga felt the weight of being alone. His friend Ezekiel was no longer there. The friendship and adventures they had shared for years now only existed in memories. Only one person remained, Alvarenga, and he was fighting alone to survive in the middle of the ocean. In the early days, Alvarenga sometimes talked to himself, expressing the thoughts that existed in his mind. His own voice, in a sense, reminded him that he was not alone. "Don't give up," he would say to himself. "You must survive. You must reach land." These conversations in his mind gave him a little more hope each time, because a person's greatest enemy, when alone, was the dark thoughts inside their mind. Even though his body was weakening physically, Alvarenga's effort to stay mentally strong was the key to his survival. Somehow, he tried to resist the pain of being alone. He spoke to himself, encouraged himself, and tried to prevent his hopes from fading. Old memories sometimes served as a source of encouragement. Alvarenga tried to keep his mind alive by remembering the time he spent as a child. The moments he spent with his family, being close to the sea, were where he found his strength to survive. "One day, I will return to land," he would tell himself. "One day I will be with my family again." The memories he kept alive in his mind sparked the desire to return to the past, to the world he had lost. But at the same time, the weight of those old memories, trying to remind him of the past, left marks on his soul. Every time he remembered, these memories made him feel the pain of time passing quickly and the increasing isolation he was experiencing. The mental collapse began to become more apparent over time. His mind would sometimes find itself in another place, in another time, or in a different reality. While his survival instincts pushed his body, psychologically, it sometimes became too much for him. In the loneliness of the ocean, he began to question how a person could keep their mind intact. Talking to himself, remembering the past, kept him alive in some way, but at some point, it wasn't enough. He began to tire mentally, getting stuck in the memories of the past and growing as exhausted by his desire to survive as his physical strength. Loneliness was creating a terrifying pressure on his mind. One day, Alvarenga experienced a deep inner collapse. He had become hopelessly tired of everything. "Maybe this is the end for me," he thought. "If they don't find me, I will die here." As his mind became trapped in these dark thoughts, he realized that it was time to face the greatest test of his inner strength. He needed to pull himself together. Somehow, he had to get back on his feet. The voice in his head urged him into action. "If you can't do this, it's over. But if you survive, it will all have meaning." These thoughts helped him turn back from the edge of destruction. He had to gather himself. Finding the strength within himself would be the only way to reach land. One day, while Alvarenga looked out at the sea alone, the dream of reaching land gave him hope once more. As he had always thought, fighting the ocean was not just a physical battle, but a mental one. He had to find the balance between his mind and body. Losing himself would have destroyed his chances of survival. Now he tried to make peace with loneliness by thinking less. He needed to make a mental revolution. Controlling his mind and staying mentally strong was the key to his survival. As the days went by, Alvarenga began to mentally recover. He found his inner strength and was wrapped in the desire to live. Mentally, he succeeded in surviving. But even though he couldn't tell how time was passing each day, this psychological battle became a tool that saved his life. Staying mentally strong was more important than physical strength. And with each passing day, the urge to survive became the only force that would guide him toward land. José Salvador Alvarenga's 438 days in the middle of the ocean were an adventure shaped by the limits of a person's struggle for survival, resilience, and the battle of hope. Despite the harsh conditions, his fight to survive every day tested not only his physical strength, but also his mental capacity. As the days passed while his body was pushed to its limits, the power of his survival instinct gave him the strength to keep going. The passage of time had a different meaning in the middle of the ocean. The boat had stopped being a shelter that kept him safe and had become a place of isolation. Every passing day, his body grew weaker, his muscles deteriorated, his skin dried out from lack of water, and his immune system slowly began to fail. He always felt tired and in sleepless nights even though he closed his eyes wishing for sleep. It became impossible. Physically, there were moments when everything seemed on the verge of collapse. But there was one thing. He still had hope of surviving. Hope gave him strength beyond everything. As Alvarenga's body weakened from prolonged dehydration and hunger, searching for fresh water and food from the depths of the ocean was far from easy. Fishing, which seemed relatively easier at first, became more difficult with each passing day. His goal was to get one step closer to land every day, waking up each morning with the hope of survival and rescue. Under the brutal conditions of the ocean, it was uncertain what would happen when, yet every new day brought him a glimmer of hope. As food and water sources dwindled, Alvarenga had to fight alone for his survival. Trusting his instincts, he battled each day to survive in the pitch-black ocean. Fishing and collecting rainwater became a way of life for him. He collected, the rainwater dripping into the boat, making sure not to waste a single drop, with each drop growing his hope. These tiny rain droplets had become a critical resource for keeping his life going. Every pain in his body, every difficulty, served as a reminder for Alvarenga. "You must survive," he told himself. "One day you'll escape. One day you'll reach land." Even though his body was physically breaking down, his survival instincts and mental strength were opening new paths for him to keep going. At night, alone in the dark waters of the ocean, Alvarenga would sometimes look at the stars and occupy himself with plans for reaching land. In his eyes, there was a dark world, but the light of life had not yet gone out. The thought of reaching land guided him, even in the darkest moments. Alvarenga's struggle for survival was not just a physiological battle, but also a mental one. The ocean, which had once symbolized freedom and the peace the sea provided, had now turned into a prison. In his mind, there were moments when everything seemed to come to an end. Many times when he felt close to death, he would revive his desire to live by imagining the dream of reaching land again and again. During every emotional breakdown, every moment of loneliness, he would repeat to himself, "Every day I'm getting one step closer to land." There were many times he fell into despair because nothing seemed to change in the middle of the ocean. The sea appeared endless, and time seemed to have stopped. The passage of days, though exhausting for Alvarenga, always found his survival instinct remaining strong. This inner strength carried him forward with each passing day. One day, while fishing, he gained more confidence in his belief that those difficult days would pass, relying on the increasing number of fish he caught each time. However, the 438 days spent in the middle of the ocean had caused not just physical but mental fatigue. Having been alone for so long, Alvarenga tried to keep from feeling isolated by talking to himself. To stay mentally healthy, he recalled old memories, thinking about his family and loved ones. He filled the void in his relationship with time by keeping his thoughts, his goal, and his desire to survive alive. Though he sometimes felt like he was losing his mind, each passing minute, he woke up feeling that the next day would bring him hope. Throughout this long period, Alvarenga's fight for survival was more than just the struggle of one person to stay alive. It proved that the survival instinct inside a human being is one of the oldest and strongest emotions in human history. Despite the challenges, the losses, and the moments when it all seemed over, there was a light inside Alvarenga that never went out. The sun rising every morning gave him one more hope. After 438 days, his struggle for survival had become an example of courage, resilience, and hope. As the days passed, Alvarenga kept moving forward toward land with hope. Despite everything, the ocean, which had once connected him to nature, had now become a test. But every day his survival instincts continued to keep him going. After 438 days, that once impossible moment finally arrived. José Salvador Alvarenga, after years of struggling to survive in the middle of the ocean, managed to reach a shore near the Marshall Islands. Above all, this was not just a physical victory. Alvarenga's arrival on land was also a spiritual triumph. It was a miracle that showed how far a person's limits could be pushed and how powerful the survival instinct could be. Throughout the years he spent in the middle of the ocean, Alvarenga felt the longing for land every day. His body deteriorated more with each passing day, and he was on the verge of psychological collapse, but the desire to survive always stayed in the forefront. The seemingly endless days he spent in the ocean came to an end at an unexpected moment. One morning, before the sun had risen, Alvarenga's boat suddenly collided with a piece of land on the ocean's surface. At first, he couldn't comprehend what had happened. His mind suddenly cleared and he rubbed his eyes, believing it was a reflection of the land. But his eyes showed him a miracle. He realized that it was indeed land. For a moment, time stopped. The deep emptiness he had felt during the years of solitude and helplessness was suddenly replaced with an incredible sense of relief. In that instant, he realized that reaching land was not just a physical victory, but also a spiritual one. He had made peace with himself. Leaving his losses behind, along with the pain of everything, he had finally taken a step toward a new beginning. From the moment he set foot on land, Alvarenga knew that the force that had conquered him was not the vast, brutal power of the ocean, but the strength of the human survival instinct. The ocean had been both a trap and a realm of freedom for Alvarenga. With each passing day, he had come to understand the value of life more deeply. He now knew that every breath was a miracle, and every step was precious. When he took his first step on land, despite the weakness in his body, there was a strength in his spirit. While lost in the ocean, he had felt the power of his survival instinct and how, above all, it was this inner strength that kept him going. He felt as though he had been reborn. With every second he spent on land, he existed again as a human. His body was nearly exhausted, but the resilience within him had kept him standing despite everything. When Alvarenga first set foot on land, it felt as if survival had won him the greatest victory in the world. His eyes still had trouble believing as he looked at the land. He felt a kind of destructive relief just from surviving. At that moment, he had thrown off the weight of everything in the world. The waves of the sea and the wind no longer felt threatening. They felt like freedom. The heavy pressure in his mind, the pain of losses, and the fears that had plagued him for years suddenly began to fade. Loneliness, loss, and the devastation brought on by struggles were now in the past. He felt the beginning of a new life. However, after setting foot on land, he should not expect to be immediately free or for everything to return to normal. He was deeply fatigued, both mentally and physically. But Alvarenga had at last survived one of the toughest conditions a person could endure. In that moment, he became a symbolic example of both the inner strength he possessed and the survival stories in human history. His body was weak, hungry, and dehydrated. Yet setting foot on land was like a miracle to him. The pain from the death of his lost friend and the deep wounds from his loneliness still remained inside him. But now, on land, he wanted to begin a new life and make peace with all the losses. After the relief of his rescue, fishermen who noticed him extended a helping hand. His survival had become a beacon of hope for others. A man surviving alone in the ocean for 438 days was a miracle. It had become an unforgettable lesson in the power of human survival. From that moment on, Alvarenga became not just the hero of a survival story, but a symbol of how a person can find hope and resilience even in the darkest times. It would be much later that he would realize that the 438 days spent in the ocean were not just a physical challenge but also a mental and emotional test. However, when he set foot on land and started looking back, he understood that everything he had gone through, every loss and every struggle had shaped him into the person he had become. Surviving in the ocean had not only taught him how to fight for survival, but also when to surrender and when to fight even harder instead of giving up. Alvarenga had experienced a miracle upon reaching land, but this miracle had also become a great lesson for humanity. The survival instinct, the power of hope, the dimensions of inner resilience, and the true meaning of endurance had turned into an unforgettable story for everyone.